The morning light filtered through cracked blinds of my tiny apartment, painting streaks of gold across the dust motes that danced lazily in the air, as though time itself were suspended in these narrow beams. I sat on the edge of my bed, shoulders hunched, fingers tracing the worn fabric of the quilt my grandmother had made years ago, the one that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Outside, the city was waking up, the distant roar of buses, the soft shuffle of feet on the pavement, the hum of conversations that seemed to echo from one street to another. But inside this small, cluttered room, the world felt hollow, as if it had forgotten me. I thought about her, and the memory hit me with a weight that made my chest ache. I remembered her laugh, bright and careless, the way it filled the corners of my life, and left me both exhilarated and terrified, afraid to breathe too loudly lest I wake myself from the spell. Time, I realized, was both my enemy and my only companion. Every second I spent imagining this conversation was a second stolen from the present, yet also a balm to the gnawing ache in my chest. I imagined telling him to savor the tiny, mundane moments. The way she would tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear absent-mindedly, the way her fingers traced the rim of a cup as if she were measuring the weight of the world, the way she leaned back in laughter that made everything else fade. I would warn him without warning him, tell him to act without revealing the ending, to hold her closer without knowing it would be the last time she would allow such proximity. And I would beg him to remember everything, because the memory of love was all that remained once it was gone. I imagined the desperation in my past self's eyes, the disbelief, the incredulity that someone could speak across time, and yet I could see the flicker of understanding that would pass through him, that brief spark of recognition that the future, though unseen, was watching, breathing alongside him. And suddenly, the impossibility of it all didn't feel quite as unbearable. Could I give him the wisdom of years without extinguishing the innocence, the hope, the desperate, clumsy adoration that had defined that version of me? I imagined sitting across from my past self in that familiar cafe, the same one where we had spent endless hours laughing over steaming mugs of coffee and shared dreams, and tried to explain the inevitability of loss, the cruel twist of fate that would separate us. My mind painted the scene in minute detail, the way his hair would stick up from a night of restless sleep, the nervous flick of his eyes as he tried to read me, without understanding the truth, the way he would fidget with the ring I hadn't yet found the courage to buy, the one that symbolized a promise I never made. I had tried, so many times, to bury the memories, to pretend that life had a different shape, that the emptiness could be filled with work, with fleeting distractions, with books and music. But every step forward seemed to loop me back to her. And this morning was no different. I could feel the weight of every missed opportunity pressing on my ribs, the words I hadn't said, the courage I hadn't summoned, the hands I hadn't held. I glanced at my phone on the bedside table, its screen reflecting the pale light, the messages long deleted, the photos carefully archived, the digital footprints of life that once burned so brightly and now felt like ashes. A thought occurred to me then, an impossible, reckless thought that made my stomach twist in both fear and longing. What if I could contact me from that day, the me who still loved her with a heart so raw it threatened to shatter at the slightest wrong move? What would I tell him? Her hair had always smelled faintly of rain and roses, the soft curl that brushed her cheek when she leaned toward me in those rare, quiet moments of affection, the way her eyes glimmered with curiosity and mischief, like she carried entire galaxies behind those irises. And yet, all that brilliance now existed only in my mind, as ephemeral and fragile as smoke slipping through a cracked window. I took a deep breath, trying to anchor myself in the present, but the past clawed at me insistently. The idea both exhilarated and terrified me. I knew, with a clarity born from years of regret, that meddling with time was dangerous, that the delicate threads of cause and effect could unravel under the slightest interference. Yet the temptation was irresistible. The past version of me, naive, hopeful, vulnerable, was so achingly human that I could almost reach to the veil of years and touch him, could almost feel his pulse beneath my fingertips, could almost whisper the secrets of the universe into his ear and hope that he would listen. I pictured his eyes, wide and uncomprehending at first, then narrowing in disbelief, and finally, perhaps, softening with understanding, as if recognizing a ghost who had come to save him from a heartbreak he had yet to endure. The thought made my chest tighten, made the ache of longing flare like fire in my ribs, because I realized that I did not just want to guide him. I wanted to witness him, to see him feel what I had felt, to give him a chance to hold on to her when I had failed. And beneath all of it, a quiet, trembling hope lingered that in reaching across the divide of years, I might also find some redemption for myself, some way to reconcile the man I was with the man I had become. The idea both exhilarated and terrified me. I knew, with a clarity, the thought of reaching out to my past self consumed me for hours, even as the day unfolded in the ordinary rhythm of a world that seemed oblivious to my turmoil. I wandered through the streets, my hands buried in the pockets of my worn jacket, my eyes tracing the familiar contours of buildings that had witnessed our laughter, our fights, and our quiet, unspoken moments. Every corner I passed seemed to echo with her presence. The curve of the cafe awning where we had shared our first rainy day kiss, the bookstore window where she had lingered, fingers brushing over the spines of novels as if choosing stories to match the shape of her heart, the little park bench where we had once sat in silence and found understanding in the mere act of being together. The city felt alive with memories, yet painfully indifferent to the man I had become, a man who had tried and failed to hold on to what he loved most. And in that indifference, I felt both despair and clarity. Life would continue, whether I intervened or not, whether I spoke to my past self or remained silent, but the possibility of reaching to the chasm of time, of speaking directly to the version of me who still had everything to lose, became an obsession I could not ignore. I imagined how I would do it, in meticulous detail, as though rehearsing a scene in a play that had no script. I would sit across from him in that familiar cafe, the smell of roasted coffee beans thick in the air, the soft clatter of cups and saucers around us, and I would speak carefully, giving him guidance without stealing the beauty of his innocence, warning him without frightening him, sharing the weight of the world in a way that only someone who had lived through its crushing silence could. I closed my eyes and let the memories flood me, a tidal wave of laughter, tears, whispered confessions, and silent moments heavy with meaning. I felt the past like a second skin, clinging, comforting, suffocating, and when I opened my eyes, the world outside the window seemed sharper, crueler, yet achingly beautiful in its indifference. I realized then that love, in all its painful perfection, could exist without being held, could burn without consuming, could linger without resolving, and with that, a shiver ran down my spine, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and longing, as if the universe itself had paused to listen, waiting to see if I would act or if I would remain frozen, a solitary figure in a sunlit room haunted by the echo of a life that could have been. I sat there, the quilt heavy over my legs, my coffee gone cold on the nightstand, and the realization hit me. I had become both observer and participant, trapped in a paradox where memory and longing intertwined, where every heartbeat was a reminder that some things could never be fixed, yet some things could still be felt with unimaginable intensity. I thought of the day she had left, the day that had carved a permanent hollow into my chest, and the way no one had remembered me. Not really, not in the ways that mattered. Friends had smiled politely, strangers had nodded, but in the blur of their eyes, I had vanished, erased by circumstance and time. And she, my beautiful, incandescent, unattainable her, had lost it, had crumbled in ways I could still feel, though she would never know it. That memory was a knife that twisted with each passing year, sharp and precise, cutting away at the residue of hope I tried to cling to. And yet, amidst the ache, the despair, the relentless weight of absence, there was a strange, fragile glimmer, the thought that maybe, just maybe, if I could reach across the divide of time, if I could speak to that version of myself, I could change the course of something. Or at least, I could bear witness to it one last time, honor it, preserve it, and let the love that had once been the center of my universe exist in some form again, if only in the mind of a man who had never stopped believing. I spent the afternoon wandering aimlessly, seeking the familiar cafes, the parks, the quiet corners where our laughter had once mingled with the city's ambient hum. Everywhere I looked, I saw shadows of her, echoes of moments that would never return, and with each sighting, the ache deepened, sharp and insistent, as though the universe itself were reminding me of what had been lost. I passed the bookstore where she had once lingered, running my fingers along the cold glass, imagining her smile, the tilt of her head as she considered the rows of novels, the light catching the strands of hair that framed her face like a halo. I could almost hear her voice in the murmur of the wind, soft and teasing, calling my name with familiarity that belonged to a world that no longer existed. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a need to act that bordered on desperation. The past self I longed to contact was not just a memory. He was a living, breathing man who still had a chance, and I was the only one who could reach him, the only one who could try to rewrite the story before it had fully unfolded. I worked through the night, fueled by a mixture of desperation and adrenaline, try to construct a method that might allow a message to cross the divide of years. I didn't know if it would be words, a note left in a book, an email that would reach him in some fantastical twist of fate, or something stranger, something that defied explanation. Each attempt in my mind felt simultaneously fragile and monumental, like balancing a fragile crystal on the edge of a cliff and hoping it wouldn't shatter. I wrote letters to him I could never send, pouring into them every emotion I had buried over the years. The longing, the fear, the ache of absence, the vivid, aching memory of her laughter, the curve of her smile that had haunted my dreams. I paused often, staring at the blank walls, imagining the past version of me reading these words, feeling the tremor in his chest, the sudden, disorienting sense that someone from the future was watching, guiding, trying to protect him from heartbreak he had not yet endured. I felt as though my entire being had contracted into this single, impossible task, as though the world had narrowed down to one fragile, tenuous hope, that I could intervene, that I could somehow reach through the unyielding flow of time and whisper truth into the ears of a man who didn't yet know it was necessary. Night had deepened into an almost tangible darkness. The city outside my window transformed into a sea of amber streetlights and murmuring shadows, each one hiding lives that moved forward, oblivious to mine. I sat hunched over my desk, scattered papers littered around me, sketches of plans, diagrams of timelines, scribbled calculations that barely made sense even to me. The idea of contacting my past self had consumed me entirely. It wasn't just longing anymore, it was an obsession, a necessity. I wanted to speak to the man I had once been, the one who loved with a reckless, unguarded heart, and warn him, guide him, perhaps even give him a sliver of hope he didn't yet know he needed. I imagined the meeting over and over in my head. The cafe, our table by the window, the scent of coffee thick in the air, the way his eyes would widen in disbelief the moment he recognized me, the man he would one day become, older, wearier, but still tethered to the same fragile thread of love that had defined him. My hands trembled as I considered the mechanics of it all, the impossibility of bending time, of breaching the invisible walls that separated now from then. And yet, the more impossible it seemed, the more necessary it became. By the time the stars began to prick the night sky, delicate points of silver against the dark velvet, I knew that I had made a decision. I would find a way. I would reach across the impossible divide, speak to the version of me that still loved her without restraint, and try, just try, to change what had been broken. My heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and terror. I knew the cost could be high, that meddling with time might leave me with nothing, that the very act of reaching out could erase me or him or her in ways I could not imagine. And yet, in that perilous uncertainty, there was also beauty, a fragile, radiant hope that perhaps love, in its most desperate, defiant form, could transcend the boundaries of years, could speak across the void, could survive even when everything else had failed. I closed my eyes and breathed in the night, the scent of rain and earth, the distant hum of life carrying on indifferent to my plans, and I whispered into the darkness, a promise of the past, to the girl I had loved, to the boy I once was, that I would not give up, that no matter what, I would try to reach him. As evening fell, the sky bleeding pinks and purples into the horizon, I found myself back at the edge of the cafe where everything had begun. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries drifted into the street, warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions inside me. I imagined stepping through the door, sitting at the same table we had claimed so many times, and calling out to him. I rehearsed the words in my mind, over and over, feeling their weight, their power, the way they might alter the course of history or shatter it entirely. I wanted to tell him to savor the small moments, to notice the way she twirled a strand of hair absent-mindedly, the way her laughter could fill a room, the way her eyes could linger on his face in a way that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. I wanted to warn him, to guide him, to give him courage he did not yet know he possessed, but the fear of consequences gnawed at me, whispering that time was a delicate thing, a fragile thread that could unravel with the slightest interference. And yet, despite the fear, despite the impossible odds, I could not resist. The pull of what might be, the yearning to give her and myself another chance, was stronger than reason, stronger than fear, stronger than the cruel, indifferent flow of years that had already taken so much from me. But it wasn't perfect, not even close. There was hesitation, the fragile fear that comes with the knowledge that the future is unknowable. I felt the tug of uncertainty in him, the shadow of doubt that threatened to undo everything before it could begin. And then, as if in answer to my unspoken plea, she appeared, at first in fragments, a laugh from across the street, a flash of hair caught in sunlight, the echo of her presence in the rustle of leaves. My heart leapt violently, and I felt the fragile line between memory and reality blur. She had not yet remembered me, not fully, but the pull was there, subtle and irresistible. She had sensed in some way that something important was missing, that the world was slightly off-kilter, that a piece of her life had vanished without explanation. And though she did not yet know it was me, the weight of my love, the years of longing and the desperate hope I had carried like a lantern through darkness began to reach her consciousness. I whispered again, more insistently this time, focusing not on myself but on her, on the moment she might still recognize, on the traces of affection that lingered in the small, intimate gestures of our shared past. Notice him, see him, don't turn away. I felt the tremor of my words crossing the expanse, feeling them press against the boundaries of memory, threading themselves into her perception, nudging her gently toward the truth without frightening her. Every pulse, every flicker, every heartbeat became a symphony of possibility, a fragile dance between what had been, what was, and what might still be. I knew the risk. I knew that time could reject me, that our connection could shatter with the slightest misstep. But I could not stop. To let this moment slip, to let her forget me completely, to allow the version of me that loved her so deeply to remain unacknowledged, would be unbearable. And so I stayed there in the quiet hum of my apartment, speaking across the void, holding her in my mind, guiding him silently, letting hope and memory and love weave together in a tapestry of impossible possibility. I tried again, this time more deliberately, speaking in fragments, images, emotions, painting scenes you would recognize but not fully understand, letting the feeling of memory guide my words. Remember her laughter, remember the curve of her smile, don't walk away too soon, hold her hand a little longer. Each phrase felt like a prayer, a desperate plea, a bridge thrown across the abyss that separated us. And then, something miraculous happened. The ripple of recognition solidified into a pulse, a response that was unmistakably his own. I could feel in the rhythm of my heart, in the way the air seemed to thrum around me, a vibration that was both foreign and intimate. I imagined his eyes widening, staring at the cup in his hands as though it had transformed into a vessel of prophecy, a conduit of warning and love from a future he could not yet comprehend. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, I saw him smile, not the careless, unguarded smile of youth entirely, but the tentative, awed smile of someone who realizes that time, cruel and unyielding as it is, has offered him a chance, a second glimpse of a life he thought was already written. Memories of her came rushing in, unbidden and vivid. I saw the way she had tilted her head when she spoke, the way sunlight had caught her hair, turning it into molten gold, the way her hands had moved with such effortless grace that even the simplest gesture seemed intimate and profound. My chest ached with longing, and yet it was sweet in its ache, for I knew that this connection meant something delicate and dangerous, yes, but alive. I whispered her name, imagining it slipping across time like a prayer, feeling as though even the very act of thinking aloud could guide him, the younger version of me, toward choices that might prevent the heartbreak I had endured. And in that imagined space, I saw the scene, the past cafe, our table by the window, the steam rising from 2 untouched cups of coffee, the quiet hum of life around us. My younger self reached for her hand, guided not by instinct alone, but by the subtle nudge, the invisible touch of experience, of someone who had walked through the pain of loss and now spoke to him from the other side of it. The first sign that my attempt had worked was subtle, almost imperceptible, a twitch of memory, a shiver of recognition in my chest that I could not explain. I had spent the night speaking to shadows of my past, whispering desperate instructions, telling them to hold on, to notice every detail, to love without hesitation. And now, as the sun climbed higher into the sky, I felt the past version of me stirring, trembling at the edges of my consciousness. It was not full contact yet, not a conversation, not a shared moment, but a ripple, the faintest echo that something I had spoken across the impossible chasm had reached him. My hand shook as I clutched the edge of the desk, trying to ground myself, to remind myself that this was real, that the sensation was not merely the hallucination of a grief-addled mind. I closed my eyes and imagined him there, my younger self, in that familiar cafe, heart pounding as if it had always known this moment was coming, as if it had always waited for me to speak, for guidance, for a lifeline across the cruel divide of years. The thought was overwhelming, nearly suffocating, but also brought with it a surge of hope so intense it made my vision blur with tears I could no longer hold back. And then it came, the first response. Not in words, not in sight, but as a subtle shift, a fluttering in my chest, a sense of recognition, fragile and fleeting like the first tendrils of light at dawn. I imagined him there, my past self, sitting in that same cafe, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee, eyes wide in disbelief, the world tilting as he realized he was not alone. The sensation was electric, terrifying, intoxicating, and it brought tears to my eyes. I realized, in that instant, that connection alone, even without full understanding, could be enough to start changing the course of a story that had been broken for years. My heart raced as I whispered again, more urgently this time, recounting the moments he must cherish, the choices he must not ignore, the love he cannot allow to slip away. Every syllable, every breath, felt monumental, as though the weight of countless years rested on these tiny, fragile words. And yet, even as hope surged within me, fear remained a constant companion. What if this contact backfired? What if I caused irreparable damage? Not to him, but to her, to us, to the fragile threads that still tethered our hearts together. I stayed there long after dawn had spilled fully into the city, perched at the edge of my reality, listening for the faintest echo of a response, imagining the past version of me trembling as he received my words, as he felt the gravity of their meaning. Every heartbeat, every breath, was a mixture of terror and exhilaration, a delicate dance between possibility and impossibility. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that love was never just about possession or timing. It was about recognition, about witnessing, about being present even when the world forgot to notice. And in that fragile, suspended space, I realized that the act of reaching, of daring to speak across the impossible divide, was itself an affirmation, a defiance of fate, a declaration that even in loss, even in absence, love could still find a way to speak, to touch, to echo across the expanse of years that separated us. Hours passed in a haze of coffee and trembling determination, the city outside shifting from quiet night into the tentative stirrings of dawn. And then, as the first light crept along the horizon, brushing the edges of the buildings with pink and gold, something happened. I didn't see it. I didn't touch it. I barely understood it, but I felt it. A resonance, a shiver in the air that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, a sudden awareness that I was no longer entirely alone in this space, that the past was listening. I stared at the empty desk in front of me, at the notes I had scattered like breadcrumbs, and my breath caught. Was it a trick of my imagination, the result of sleepless nights and longing too deep to bear? Or had I finally, impossibly, pierced the veil that separated then from now? My fingers hovered over the paper, over the pen, over the keyboard, and for the first time, I allowed myself to speak, to whisper the words that had been trapped inside me for so long. I called out to him, my voice low, trembling, filled with a desperation that made my chest ache. I spoke his name, softly at first, then louder, as if sheer volume could carry my words across the expanse of time. Listen, you have to remember, her smile, her laugh, don't let go. The day she finally noticed a shift, the almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of life, I felt it in my chest before I saw it. I had been watching, listening, whispering, guiding, hoping that every careful nudge, Every subtle reminder I had sent across time would bring her closer to recognition without frightening her, without shattering the fragile balance we had left behind. And then it happened. A pause, a falter of her movements, the slight narrow of her eyes, the way her lips parted as if tasting a memory she didn't understand yet. My heart leapt violently, and I felt the simultaneous thrill and terror of knowing that she was beginning to remember, not fully, not consciously, but deeply enough to recognize something essential, something that had been missing all these years. The air around me seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of unsaid words, lost moments, and the fragile hope of second chances. I held my breath, terrified that even a whisper might break it, that even a thought might fracture the delicate echo of our shared past. Her first gesture was subtle, a brush of fingers against a familiar surface, a tilt of her head that mirrored something I had once loved in her, something only I had noticed. My younger self mirrored it instinctively, unaware yet profoundly guided, and the synchronicities struck me like lightning. They were moving in tandem, connected across years, across the impossible divide I had created with my desperate whispers. And in that moment, the ache I had carried for so long, the hollow absence of her presence, the cold, silent nights of yearning, burst into a flood of emotions so intense I could barely breathe. Tears stung my eyes as I realized the depth of what I had done, the fragility of the act, and the overwhelming beauty of its consequence. She was beginning to feel, to remember, to recognize the thread that had always tied us together. But recognition, I realized, was never gentle. It came in surges, in sharp jolts, in the kind of painful clarity that could make a heart break anew even as it healed. I imagined the moment she would finally understand, the collision of memories, the flood of emotion as recognition returned fully, not fragmented but whole, not hesitant but undeniable. And I knew it would hurt. It always did. The price of knowing too late, the price of love deferred and then suddenly reclaimed. I could feel it in her pause, the way her eyes lingered on him, the subtle tremor in her hands, the almost imperceptible catch in her breath. My younger self, guided but not controlled, mirrored her hesitation, the uncertainty of heart learning to navigate a world it had been kept from, the dangerous thrill of realizing that the future he had been given a glimpse of was not fixed, but pliable, fragile, alive. I whispered once more, softly this time, words meant to soothe rather than direct, words meant to remind, to anchor the whole without controlling. Breathe, remember, love carefully, but don't let go. And as the night deepened, stars pricking the heavens like distant reminders of infinity, I sat in my apartment, heart pounding with the exhilaration and terror of it all. I understood that the path I had chosen was irrevocable. Once I reached into the past, once I touched it with the fragile, trembling fingers of my longing, there was no going back. Yet in that impossibility, there was also hope. Hope that even if the world tilted, even if mistakes were made, even if hearts faltered under the weight of unfamiliar consequences, love could endure. It could survive. It could leave traces in memory, in touch, in laughter and breath, that even time itself could not erase. And for the first time in years, I felt something I thought lost forever, the fragile, trembling, incandescent possibility that love, against all odds, could still be found, still be lived, still be remembered. And then I saw it. The first crack, the first hint that intervention came with a cost. My younger self, guided by my whispers, reached toward her, and her expression changed, not with recognition, not with relief, but with confusion and something heavier, a tension that made my stomach twist. I realized that my influence, though subtle, had altered the way she perceived him, the way she perceived that moment, that single crucial instant. She froze, her gaze faltering, the warmth in her expression dimming, as if some unspoken weight pressed against her chest. I felt it like a physical blow, the ripple of consequences traveling to the fragile tapestry I had begun to weave. I wanted to shout, to stop, to erase myself from the moment entirely, but it was too late. My presence, my whispers, my desperate interventions had begun to leave their mark, and now I could only watch, heart pounding, as the world I had longed to restore teetered on the edge of something I could not control. The city outside my window shifted as if echoing my turmoil, the hum of traffic, the distant call of a train, the soft laughter of strangers who had no idea of the fragile collision of time and memory unfolding within a single apartment. I leaned back in my chair, hands trembling, head spinning with the impossible weight of responsibility. Every decision, every word I had sent back, every heartbeat I had threaded across the years carried consequences I could not predict. And yet, in the midst of fear, there was a spark of awe. I had touched the past. I had made him see. I had altered the rhythm of hearts that had already been set in motion. And even if the outcome remained uncertain, even if I had caused confusion, even if she would falter in her recognition, the act itself was proof that love, even stretched across the impossible gulf of years, could still leave its mark. I watched the faint pulse of recognition grow stronger in my younger self. In my mind, I could see him reaching for her hand, hesitating, then closing the gap he had once left open, lingering over the touch he had once considered too risky, too bold, too fragile. And in that hesitation, I understood something fundamental. Love was not something that could be rushed or forced, not even with knowledge from the future. It had to breathe, it had to falter, it had to feel like it was discovering itself anew, and in that discovery lay its beauty, its fragility, its unbearable power. I imagined her eyes meeting his, wide and bright, the spark of memory flickering, confused and disoriented, but undeniably there. My chest ached with a longing to step into that moment, to hold her, to whisper the truth, to make everything right. But I knew the rules of this fragile, impossible connection. I could guide him, I could push, I could whisper the right words at the right time, but I could not act for him. The past had unfolded with its own rhythm, and the stakes, the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. By the time twilight seeped into the city, spilling bruised purples and molten oranges across the skyline, I could feel the world shifting, subtle but undeniable, as if the air itself had begun to bend around the fragile bridge I had built across time. I had spent hours whispering, imagining, and reaching, and now the echoes of my voice and my presence seemed to have touched something in him. My younger self, the version of me who had loved her without restraint, without fear, without the caution that years had forced upon me. And yet, even as a flicker of hope glimmered in my chest, a new fear emerged, one that was sharper and more insistent than the first. Consequences. Every whisper, every mental nudge I had sent, seemed to reverberate not just in him, but in her, the girl whose laughter and warmth had once filled my universe. I could feel her confusion, her hesitation, the slightest ripple in the way she moved, in the way she looked at familiar places, in the tiny, almost imperceptible pause in her steps, as if some invisible hand had nudged her toward a memory she couldn't fully place. It was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. I was no longer just an observer of the past. I was a participant, threading myself into the delicate fabric of lives that had already been written, uncertain whether I was improving it or unraveling it entirely. She stepped closer, and I imagined the weight of years pressing into that movement, the hesitation, the instinctive fear that something essential had changed. My younger self reached out without thinking, hands trembling as they sought the familiar, and she recoiled for just a heartbeat, a pause that was both heartbreaking and necessary. I knew then that she had felt the tug of my presence, my influence, my desperate reach across time, and that she was struggling to reconcile with her own memories, her own life, her own carefully constructed walls. It was beautiful, yes, in its rawness, but it was also terrifying. I could almost see her heart beating, quick and erratic, her chest rising and falling with the realization that the world had shifted in ways she did not yet understand. And I, on the other side of time, could only watch, my soul entwined with theirs, suspended between hope and fear, desperate to do nothing and everything at once. And then it broke. The fragile dam of years, the silence, the careful hesitation, and she remembered. Not fully at first, not in words, but in the curl of her lips, the narrowing of her eyes, the subtle tremor in her fingers. Recognition flashed in her gaze. It was both joyous and agonizing. She had lost it, yes, but in that loss was a spark of memory, of love, of something irrepressible that had never truly vanished. My younger self mirrored her reaction, equally shaken, equally overwhelmed, and in that mirroring lay the beginning of reconciliation, the first step toward the delicate possibility of repair. I felt the weight of the years I carried, the despair, the longing, the emptiness, begin to lift, even as a new reality pressed down with equal force, reminding me that love, once broken, never returned without cost. But the cost of this miraculous connection became immediately apparent. She pulled her hand away, her eyes darting towards something unseen, some fan of the past I could not touch, some memory unanchored and unstable. And for a moment panic flared in my chest. I realized that even the most carefully placed whispers, even the most gentle guidance, could have consequences I had never anticipated. Her reaction, hesitant and confused, was proof that touching the past was not without risk. Even as it had opened the door to recognition, it had also shaken the delicate balance of her emotions. I imagined her thoughts racing, the question she could not yet voice. Why did she feel so drawn to him now? Why did her heart recognize something she had forgotten? And as her awareness grew, so did the weight of the emotional consequences, each one pressing on my chest like a physical force, reminded me that love, once tampered with across time, never returned without exacting a price. I could feel my younger self faltering, too, unsure of how to respond, uncertain whether to follow the guidance he had received from me or to trust the impulses of his own heart. The hesitation created a tension so thick it seemed to vibrate in the air, a silent struggle that only I could perceive, a quiet battle between instinct, memory, and intervention. I whispered again, softly this time, words meant to soothe rather than direct. Trust her. Trust yourself. The rest will follow. I felt the pulse of my presence ripple through time, hoping it was enough to steady them without pushing them into something premature, hoping that the fragile thread I had woven would hold under the strain of confusion and raw emotion. Her face, the one I had loved so completely and yet had been denied, was a storm of conflicting feelings, joy, shock, disbelief, and a kind of sorrow that made her eyes glisten in the dim light of the cafe. I imagined the way her mind struggled to reconcile the fragments of memory that my whispers had rekindled with the reality in front of her, the man who had always loved her, the version of him she had almost forgotten, and the overwhelming truth of what had been withheld by time. My younger self mirrored her uncertainty, hands slightly trembling, shoulders hunched in a posture that betrayed both awe and fear. I could feel their hearts beating in tandem, a rhythm both chaotic and beautiful, a fragile melody that threatened to shatter with the slightest misstep. And yet, in that fragile space between fear and hope, I sensed a glimmer of something profound, the possibility that love, even fractured and delayed, could heal, could endure, could carve a path through the impossible terrain of years lost. The aftermath of that first moment of recognition was nothing like I had imagined. It was not pure relief, not a clean reunion of hearts across time, but a tangle of emotion so raw it made the air feel heavy, almost unbearable. She pulled back slightly, and I could feel the hesitation, the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the way her fingers lingered in the space between them and my younger self's hand, as if testing reality itself. My younger self froze too, caught between the guidance I had sent him and the overwhelming flood of memory and emotion that now coursed through both of them. I could feel it in my chest, the ache of wanting to step forward, to reassure her, to erase the confusion, but I knew I couldn't. I was the invisible thread, the unseen hand that had nudged them together, and the rules of this fragile temporal connection forbade me from interfering directly. I had given them the chance, and now they had to navigate the consequences themselves. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. I whispered to him, softly, words meant to anchor and soothe, to guide without controlling. Hold her. Just hold her. Don't let go this time. The words passed through the invisible current between us, and I felt them land, small and trembling but tangible. And she, feeling it, finally allowed herself to reach, to move, to touch, and the world shifted. I imagined collision of two hearts across time, the merging of memory and presence, past and present, as if all the years of longing had compressed into a single incandescent moment. And in that moment, everything I had lost, everything I had mourned, everything I had feared was gone, replaced by something new, fragile but alive, glowing in the soft light of understanding and recognition. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the edges of my vision, but I could not stop smiling. I could feel her trembling, hear her breath catch. sensed the tremor of her voice as she whispered words she had almost forgotten but would never forget again. And in that whisper, I found everything I had been searching for, the proof that love, even stretched across impossible boundaries, could survive, could endure, could ignite the hearts of those who have been separated by time and circumstance. And yet, the cost remained visible, tangible. Confusion, fragility, hesitation. The knowledge that love rebuilt was always precarious, always at risk of shattering again. But in that precariousness, there was beauty. And in the beauty, there was hope. The hope that even after years of absence, even after heartbreak, even after despair, love could find a way, if one dared to reach, to whisper, to hold on when everything else had failed. I sat back in my chair, alone once more, the soft of the city entering through the open window, and allowed myself to smile through tears. I had reached across years, whispered across the void, and witnessed the fragile miracle of love reclaimed. And though I remained invisible in their world, though my presence would never be acknowledged directly, I knew that I left my mark in the only way that truly mattered, by reminding hearts to remember, by nudging them toward connection, by letting love, in all its fragile brilliance, find its way back into the world. The ache of absence remained, yes, but it had been transformed into something gentler, a quiet, enduring light that reminded me that even in loss, even in the spaces between moments and years, love could survive, and in surviving, it could illuminate everything it touched. The night had fully settled over the city, casting long shadows across streets and buildings, yet inside the cafe, the space around them seemed suspended, held in a soft, golden glow that separated from the ordinary passage of time. I imagined them sitting across from each other now, hands trembling but finally entwined, hearts beating in a rhythm that had once been interrupted but now found its pulse again. The fear, the hesitation, the fractures of memory and time, all of it was still there, present and raw, but it no longer dominated the space. It had been transformed into something more delicate, something luminous. She looked at him, really looked, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of his face, as if seeing him for the first time and remembering him all at once. The recognition both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing on the edge of a precipice and feeling the wind carry you in two directions at once. My younger self mirrored her gaze, awe and disbelief etched into his features, and I could feel their connection solidify, fragile but undeniable, like a bridge that had been rebuilt brick by brick over the chasm of years. And then she spoke, her voice trembling, fragile and melodic, carrying the weight of years and the spark of recognition at once. I imagined every syllable piercing the invisible veil that separated us, reaching across time to touch the part of me that had always hoped, that had always waited for this moment. My heart clenched as I pictured the scene, the trembling, hesitant reconnection, the raw vulnerability laid bare, and the knowledge that though they were finally beginning to bridge the gap of lost years, the path ahead was still uncertain, still full of peril. Even as relief surged through me, it was tempered by the awareness that love, even when found again, demanded courage, patience, and a willingness to confront the scars that time had left behind. The cafe around them, the gentle hum of life continuing unaware of the fragile miracle unfolding, became a backdrop to a tableau of emotions both painful and beautiful. I imagined the soft, golden light falling across their faces, highlighting every tear, every flicker of recognition, every heartbeat trembling with the weight of newfound awareness. And in that tableau, I understood the truth I had always known but never fully accepted, that love, when it endures, is never simple, it is never clean. It is messy, fragile, terrifying, and breathtaking all at once, and the beauty of it lies in its fragility, in its capacity to survive even when the world conspires to tear it apart.